Ladies and gentlemen, thank you first of all very much for joining us. It's a very full house today, a huge encouragement to World Horse Welfare, and a pleasure to see so many of the partner agencies here, which make it much more likely that we will be successful, certainly in this country, but also overseas. That really gave me the subject of horsepower and international development. It could take quite a long time, but I hope it won't. But it sort of links in with what we've just been hearing, because it is about changing attitudes towards your relationship, a man's relationship with a horse, and what they do for you. But back in 1974, it was probably about the first time I went to visit the Save the Children's work overseas was in Ethiopia. And there was a little sort of gap in the program. So for 3 days, we went up the Simien Mountains on mules. The mules, I have to say, were this big, and they carried us and everything else, except for, oddly enough, the thunderbox, which went on somebody's head, but I won't bore you with those details. But this was very much the way that the locals moved around. They used to be a nomadic population, and they moved across the Simians a lot. They maintained their flocks by moving on. And even in 1974, by the time I got up there, when you got onto the tops, they'd been almost completely denuded because the populations had become much more static, and they were eating themselves out of everything in terms of crop for their livestock. And as a result, the environmental degradation on the mountains and on the immediate vicinities was increasing year on year. Livestock, people's behavior, impact on a much wider level than any of them really understood. Now, the Save the Children had a lot to do with those communities, but they probably wouldn't have understood directly how much a difference they could have made by having more of an impact into the livestock aspect of their lives, although they did try, getting the right balance in terms of the teams that they used to have, mostly aimed at women and children, of course, in terms of their health and welfare, but also on having a viable community. That meant understanding how the community functioned. So in that respect, I suppose I've been brought up with an eye to how communities exist, what makes them economically viable. And in many developing projects, they tend to look at the education separately, they look at the health separately, they look at a range of issues, maybe even specific diseases separately. They tend not to join them up, and they don't necessarily look at the way that they live. Agriculture was a big development issue, but on a rather different scale. Understanding how local communities fed each other and how involved the family was in that, what made it the economic unit, was less well, if not understood, certainly less well publicized. And very few of them worked together, which is hugely irritating for those like me who had the opportunity to see a number of different agencies at work in a number of different countries. And I have been in countries where World Horse Welfare, before I became involved, and they were the IRPH, in places like Pakistan, where you notice the difference because of where they'd already had an impact on the horses that were working in those countries as opposed to in other areas in those countries. And the relative prosperity of the populations that had healthy working horses. Nowadays, you would regard those as those with working equines, donkeys, mules, were probably the poorest of the poor. But in many respects, they're not poor in terms of the economic viability of those families, in terms of their ability to feed themselves. But they are poor in terms of cash, in the ability to generate cash. I mean, as more and more people move towards cities, and I'm afraid the streets paved with gold syndrome is a universal quality. It happens everywhere, and it still happens here. that has an impact, because the equines who maybe have been better off, along with the people working in a rural environment, are then in an urban and very foreign environment where grass is not an option, where they live on a diet which is unfortunately anthropomorphic in the sense that they're eating what is left over from everybody else's rubbish. It's a viable life for those who have a cart and a horse and go out collecting recyclable objects. I've seen projects where recycling from those huge tips you see in cities has made enough money to keep those families going. But it doesn't really make enough money to allow the horses that are part of their working lives, that allow them to have that existence, to exist any better, and probably rather worse than they did before. Now, we as an organisation, I think over the years, have made an enormous impact by making horses' working lives more comfortable in terms of the technical, practical aspects of shoeing, saddlery, and bitting. And we know we can make it more comfortable for them to work, but the environments in which we work and in which they work is much more difficult to change in the long term. Because if those individuals who have those animals, if their life doesn't improve, if they don't become more productive, more efficient, then the long-term effect on those animals and their future animals is not really going to get any better. And it's one of those grey areas between development agencies that is not sufficiently well joined up. My more recent interest is through microfinance, microcredit schemes, supporting those who have the interest to improve their lives, to become more efficient, who know they need to be able to borrow to improve what they have. And in some places, we've got these to join up. Lesotho is one of them. There's a microfinance scheme there, and also a scheme with World Horse Welfare, to try and invest in their knowledge, that it then becomes instantly connected to greater productivity and more success. Making that connection is crucial for a lot of our horses that we work with. They have to be part of a successful working environment. And when you say that, it probably isn't true here. Actually, it is. You've just been talking about that in relation to the racing industry and the number of people it employs. It is important that it is viable and it works for people. But you've just been hearing much closer to home about the difficulties we face in changing attitudes. The traveller communities do have, and again, I'm afraid the Save the Children have a context here, because we used to have a project with travellers really to try and get the youngsters into schools for any time at all, and never mind for a long time. But already, even in those permanent sites that existed, there was no real allowance for horses, but they were there. They were there because they were part of their culture, part of the tradition that those families wanted to have. Some of them didn't travel very often, maybe only to Appleby and back. But the ability to improve the lives of those horses was hugely constrained by the fact that they weren't adding any real value. They were there as part of that status. And if there was a fascinating talk about the attitudes, cultures that we don't understand enough, about how to make a difference. And if we don't understand the travelling community enough to be able to make a long-term difference to the horses' welfare, we are going to struggle, I think, to make a real impact in developing better projects overseas. We have to understand where the business connects with the welfare to really make the work that we can do count. But supporters of World Horse Welfare expect us and their money to go to make a real difference to the horses and the donkeys and who are working. They would not expect us to go out and work with the populations to try and re-educate their culture and make sure that their businesses were successful. And that's quite a difficult combination to make. But there are organisations out there, like Save the Children, but a lot of others, who work in human development programmes, who may well come across the working horses. And they may look at them pityingly, but they will say, we don't understand. We don't do that. We just look after the people. What we do need is a better understanding of how to get those people to recognize that there are organizations like the World Horse Welfare who have the ability to do the other part of the equation, and that if both these two parts of the equation come together, then not only will you improve the lives of the equines who are working, but you will probably improve the livelihoods of those who are working with them. And that might provide the long-term improvement for those horses in those environments. One day, what Mr. Ford started will presumably become available to more people. But in some cases, of course, the horse will still remain a pretty cost-effective work ally. The other part of the equation in development terms is that I mention education, I mention health, can mention diseases, all sorts. Occasionally somebody will mention road building, bridges. Very seldom do they mention transport and how transport is relevant to everything that you do. That is equally true in this country. Transport is the key to understanding why horses are so important in many of these working populations, because that is the key to why they are necessary. And if people don't remember transport as part of their overall development projects, they are making a serious mistake, and lots of them still do. There are places where we can plug into this equation. We do need to do it better. But talks like we've had this morning should remind us. We start with the horse as the key, the welfare of the horse as the key. But we must be too blinkered in our own approach to that, because we do, if we want long-term improvement, we do have to understand how those animals relate to the people, the society that they live in, and how we need to be able to explain to the society that they live in how to make it better for the horse in the long run. As we increase our own awareness, we have to increase our work with partners and to raise that level of understanding. Events like this are really important. Every year you will learn something from these conferences. All of us do. And if you pardon, I'm going to say something slightly controversial, which I will no doubt pay for in the end. Do not let us be too hijacked by issues like the Grand National when there are actually bigger issues of equine welfare out there for us to deal with. Thank you.